We're starting in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region, where Russian authorities claim that they have taken control of the city of Soledar. But this has been denied by a Ukrainian army spokesperson who said that fighting there is continuing. Well, troops on the front line there have told the BBC that they welcome the news from the UK that they're to receive around a dozen Challenger tanks, a move that they hope will turn the tide in the war. The BBC's Andrew Harding has spent some time with a tank unit near Bakhmut. He and his team have sent this report.
Lurking in a snowbound forest just behind the front lines, a cluster of Ukrainian tanks. But these are ancient war horses, half a century old. No match for Russia's army. They're just not suitable for this era, the company commander readily admits. They work, but the technology has moved on. Which is why there's great excitement here about the prospect of new Western machines. If you could have any tank, Challenger, Leopard, Abrams, any of these foreign tanks that are being offered, would it make a difference?
I think Abrams, Leopard, Challenge is very good for us.
Any tank?
Any tanks, any tanks. It's help for us for victory.
Suddenly, there's incoming fire close by. A hurried exit for us, and a reminder of the unpredictable nature of artillery warfare. We head closer to the front, towards two furiously contested towns, Soledar and Bakhmut. Ukrainian footage of a recent tank battle here, firing on the move. On a frozen hillside near Bakhmut, we watch more Ukrainian tanks in action. They call this section of the front line the meat grinder, a savage artillery war that has raged for months with precious little progress on either side. But the Ukrainians here insist that's about to change. If, that is, they get Western tanks here soon. If you're going to counterattack, if you're going to seize more territory, then you need tanks, you need mobile artillery.
Sure. It's very useful for counterattacking, because infantry covered by tanks, for sure, win.
And without that, these front lines are going to be stuck like they are.
Yeah.
For now, it grinds on. A cold and lethal winter stalemate. Andrew Harding, BBC News, in Ukraine's Donbass.
Andrew Harding with that report. Let's talk to the former UK Ministry of Defence security expert, foreign policy analyst, Professor Paul Moorcraft, who joins us live. Professor, when it comes to what we're hearing from the soldiers there, the Ukrainian military on the ground, the importance of getting these tanks, we're talking about more than a handful of tanks, but not an immense number. But just when they describe this as a game changer, what are we to understand from that?
This is highly symbolic. From the Russian perspective, this is a move from a phony war where we're supporting Ukraine. This implies almost a direct confrontation between Britain and NATO and the Russians. The Russians will take this very seriously as a symbol, and so will the Ukrainians. But they have to understand that the Challenger 2 is a very good weapon. I saw it operating in Iraq and elsewhere. It's a good tank. The trouble is, it needs training. It takes time. You've got to get the squad. You've got to train the Ukrainians, probably in Britain, on the squadron, 12, 14 tanks. Then you've got to get the tank transporters. You've got to deal with this. The Challenger 2 has very specific ammunition for the rifle barrel. So it needs a lot of training. That will take, even if you rush it, 3 to 4 months. So although the Ukrainians are right to feel good in the sense that Britain has broken the logjam because they expect Leopards from the Germans, although it would be awkward to have Leopard tanks again in Ukraine or German tanks in Ukraine, the American Abraham. So this is in a sense is escalated highly symbolically, but it may not help the Ukrainians in time for the obviously very imminent spring offensive from the Russians.
Is your understanding that the symbolic nature of giving these tanks, these particular tanks to the Ukrainian military, is that why this hasn't been done previously? Because let's face it, the Ukrainian military, President Zelensky, they've been calling for this kind of kit for a long, long time now.
Well, there's a reluctance to escalate. It is an escalation, as I said, a symbolic escalation and a practical one, because if it leads, as I said, to Leopards and Abrahams, the Leopards are not so... We can afford to send 20 or 30 of the older Challenger 2. We're moving up the Challenger 3. But it's the training. We need to send a lot more practical equipment. And above all, not just missile defense systems. The Ukrainians need modern aircraft. And the original deal, which the idea was that the Poles could send some of their newer aircraft and then backfill, or at least their MiG-29s, and then backfill with new American aircraft. Apparently the Chinese stepped in. We're not sure about that, but that's probably what happened. So what the Ukrainians need is modern aircraft. And then, in a sense, you're moving to a real combat situation between NATO and Russia. It's important. It is encouraging the Ukrainians to fight on, even though they're going to be frustrated by the time it takes to train, as I said. But this is a major, from the Russian perspective, they're going to be extremely concerned about this if it leads to the follow-on of a lot more NATO tanks. This is moving into a newer, dangerous escalation.
It's important to just state that this isn't NATO tanks. These are NATO member states offering this kind of equipment to Ukraine. But you're suggesting that the symbolism is Russia will see this as a NATO alliance move, because we're not talking about NATO here. We're talking about individual member states.
We are indirectly. This is a proxy war and it's expanding. The amount of HIMARS, the American artillery, has made a big difference in the Ukrainian advances, particularly in Kherson. So the artillery weapons, I can't be sure, but the equipment is very sophisticated. Each round it's got to be calibrated. Ukrainians are smart, but whether they've got unofficially American artillery officers there, I don't know, but there would have to be a lot of support for that. So you've got new artillery, you've got new Patriots coming in, which are quite efficient if they're maintained properly, but again, sophisticated. And these Challenger tanks, four-man crew, so you need to train, 30 or 40 people and the backup, the drivers for the emergency tank carrier vehicles. So the Ukrainians will need a lot of training. But as I said, the Russians will see this. You're saying it's NATO equipment, but you've got NATO trainers. You've got NATO officers, probably just in Poland at best. So the Russians, in a sense, I keep saying that, have a right to say, we're fighting NATO. That's the propaganda they're using at home in Russia. This big escalation, the Russians are going to escalate back. Whether they're going to use tactical nuclear weapons, they threaten to do so. At the moment, they're going to fight NATO modern weapons with some of their older equipment, because they're T-72s and the later ones. They're not using the ultra-modern Armata ones. But the Russian tanks are very good. They've been modernized. The Ukrainian tanks okay, but as the interviewer said, the package said, they're 40 or 50 years old. The Challenger came into use, general use in 1982. The last ones the Army got was in 2002. So they're 20-odd years old. They will make a difference if they get there in time and lead to other NATO numbers.
Professor Moorcraft, it's really, really good of you to give your assessment. I'm sure the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, would deny that this is a NATO endeavour, but we get your point about the symbolism of this, and we're hearing the importance with which the Ukrainians are putting on the handing over of these Challenger tanks. For the time being, Professor Paul Moorcraft, thank you.